Well, joining me now to look at the week in federal politics are two journalist colleagues. Tonda MacCharles is a parliamentary reporter for the Toronto Star, and Ian Bailey is with the Globe and Mail's Ottawa Bureau, and he's the author of the Globe's Politics Briefing newsletter. Both of you, thanks for joining us.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi, how you doing?
Okay, now this was a week, obviously, it's one of the few weeks where COVID-19 is being bumped from our discussion, because this was a week so completely dominated by issues relating to Canada's Indigenous people. Let's start with, and let's focus on the first big event, and that is the government's handling of the residential school issue since it exploded with that discovery last week of those graves in Kamloops, BC. I want to look at the government, how it has handled it over the week, with a week which started one way and ended with the Prime Minister musing about possibly taking the Catholic Church to court. Tonda, what do you make of it?
Right. Well, I think that, I asked those questions around those documents because that is the one thing that is within the federal government's control. And all week long, in response to the tragic story in Kamloops, we've heard the federal government say, all our response has to be Indigenous-led and led by the communities, and that is true. However, there are Indigenous-led research centers that are trying to support Kamloops and other communities that are demanding documents within the possession of the federal government. They are both federal government-generated documents and records that the churches themselves generated, but are in the possession of various archives in the country, including the federal government's possession. And they're demanding access to those documents. And so, at the end of 7 days after that news first broke, we still didn't have a clear answer. Why won't the government literally compel those documents? And I found the Prime Minister's answer today kind of puzzling. He continues to insist that it's up to Catholics to pressure the Catholic Church, which is the one that's withholding them, to release them. And it's up to Catholics to pressure the Catholic Church and the priests and the bishops to get the Pope to apologize for the Church's role in these things. And it's kind of astonishing to me. I feel like he threw that out about, before we go to use other tools and before we, resort to start suing the court. I don't think that is actually something that is on the table. I mean, we heard in a committee this week, federal officials saying that, throwing up their hands and saying the federal government doesn't have the legal ability. But in fact, many of the lawyers involved in these kinds of cases say the federal government actually does. So I think stay tuned. I think that's still an unresolved question, but it's a huge one. It's one that's really on the minds of Canadians. They don't want to be lectured about how they should and shouldn't feel about this. They know how they feel about it. They're outraged. They want to do anything they can to help. What they don't understand is the federal role. Okay,
Ian, what do you make of this? There's so many aspects to this issue. We saw some funding announced this week. Carolyn Bennett, a Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, saying that groups can now access $27 million in funding, but there have been questions about the response, about the timing, about how long it's taken. What do you make of the response?
Well, what I saw this week, and especially today, is a government struggling to sort of be ahead of the public anger on this file, the public concern on this file. A politician out here in BC once spoke about the best strategy for a government in situations sort of where the public is angry, to try and get ahead of that anger and embrace that anger. And it seemed reflected in the Prime Minister's striking comments on the Catholic Church today. But as Tonda says, the federal government has considerable responsibility on this file in terms of documents, but also much of this is unfolded in the lifetime of the Trudeau government. And so this is an issue that they own and one they're going to own going forward. I'm in British Columbia as we're talking today, and on the steps of the art gallery not far from this room, there's a shrine. It's a shrine reflecting last week's disclosure with the deaths of more than 200, with the burial of more than 200 children. And at all hours of the day, all day, there are people there at those steps looking at what they're seeing there. And I just mentioned this to say, this isn't going away, I don't think. I mean, this is going to be around for a very long time.
Okay.
It's not going to affect British Columbia. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's not going, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but it's not going to go away also because on Monday there's going to be a vote in the House of Commons on an NDP motion asking the government both to guarantee funding for forensic searches of any place where a First Nation community would ask for that kind of search of a potential burial site, but also for the government to cease and desist any of the court challenges that it has outstanding on three different fronts with regards to Indigenous people. That motion is going to pass because it's going to have the support of all the opposition parties. What do you make of that, Ian?
Well, it's another chapter in this long story. The motion will pass. We heard the Prime Minister at length rationalizing the government position today, and I don't suspect that's going to change. We also heard Minister Miller earlier in the day, sort of, as I recall, speaking to this. So it will pass, but the government is entrenched in their position on this matter of sort of working this through to, as I guess the Prime Minister said, make sure that these young people get some kind of compensation.
Okay, I want to get to the other big development because it was equally as big, and many would say that it's a very forward-looking development, and that is about murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. The government's response after 2 years after the final report from the National Inquiry, the government came through with its response, or its pathway this week. Tonda, what do you make of it? Some people are saying it's too little, too late, it's too timid, and there's not enough details. Today, Carolyn Bennett, the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, was saying, no, there are details, there will be costing, there are concrete commitments. What do you make of it?
Look, what was released was several documents, in fact, documents and plans that were not just the federal government's plan, but by other organizations that are involved in dealing with the various issues around missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls. And so it was a bit of a messy rollout in this respect. Everything was sort of put on the table, and it wasn't clear. Whoops, sorry, guys.
It's all right. There we go. It's all right.
Are you all right?
Go on. Yeah, keep going.
So it wasn't clear what exactly initially was the federal government's commitment. And the federal government's commitments in this area span a whole number of actions, if you will. Some of them are involving housing and shelters, and some of them involve getting the RCMP involved in reopening unresolved cases. And there's a massive number of actions there that they suggest that they will pursue as priorities, and they've put down $2.2 billion over 5 years to achieve some of those. Look, it was a long time coming. The process of getting to yesterday was very fraught. We saw some takeaway groups, the Native Women's Association of Canada, preempted all of that the other day by saying it was a bad process, and here's our plan, and this will cost $30 million a year to implement. They've got specific actions. There are other critics who came for it. I think, look, these are complex issues, and the relationships about who gets say how things get done and led complicate all of the resolution of those issues. We saw that in spades this week, not just on the burials front, but on the responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls, and now this other inquiry, the missing and murdered Aboriginal women. And so I think that Bennett says we can hold governments to account with these documents. I'm not so sure. She's also saying that this is meant to prevent other governments from rolling back the progress they've made. Frankly, I think that it's going to be pretty hard to do because it was a very, very complicated, complex document that I don't think Canadians have got their arms around yet.
Okay, Ian, I want to end on you, on your comments on this. This, of course, has been such a huge issue in British Columbia, where you are now, because of the highway of death, for example, the highway of tears, I think it's called. I mean, this issue is so huge. One of the comments was from Marion Buller, the former lead of the inquiry, and her comment yesterday was that there were several measures that could have been announced within days of the release of their final report 2 years ago. For example, creating a Deputy Commissioner of Corrections and new RCMP responsibilities and prevention measures and crime enforcement and better cell phone reception. You know, there were things that could have been announced within weeks, and it's taken 2 years. I wonder just for your general impressions of it.
Well, you know, this report was coming. Would it have come out this way if not for the disclosures of last week, disclosures about what's happened to Kamloops? It seems a bit short and a bit long promises, given this file has gone on for quite some time. So it seems, excuse me, it seems, you know, well-intentioned, but just a lot more promises. But we'll see. I mean, this is really for the Indigenous community of Canada to many degrees consider and decide whether it works for them and whether it's justified for them.
Okay, something tells me we won't be. This won't be the last we speak on both of these issues and on the overall issue of reconciliation. I want to thank both of you. Wish you a good weekend.
Same to you.
All the best.